All right, hello everyone. So I'm really excited to be here. This is one of my favorite audiences in general to be speaking to. I've been coming to the Conscious Capitalism events in the US almost since the beginning, like 7 or 8 years ago for me. I think what keeps me coming back is something about the people that show up at these that are looking for more conscious approaches to business are exactly the ones that I want to reach for my purpose. I capture my purpose in life as I show people a radical new way to organize power. And for that to land, there has to be some consciousness of how we organize power and at least some openness to exploring pretty different ways of organizing and running a company. So I'm going to try to give you a glimpse of that, a whirlwind tour of a radical new way to organize power in a company. And before I can do that, I need my clicker. Here it is. Hopefully, great. So let me start with a story. A little bit about where this came from. This is a true story. I'm a pilot, a private pilot. I got my pilot's license back in 2000, something like that, a while ago. And while I was a student pilot, I was a new CEO at the time. I was learning to fly. I was still a student pilot. I had about 20 hours of flight time under my belt when I had my first cross-country solo flight. It's my first flight with no instructor where I'm flying hundreds of miles away from home. They actually let you get up alone in an airplane with about 20 hours of experience, which I was kind of surprised to find out, but okay, they thought it was safe, so I got up, started flying. Along my journey, the low voltage light comes on my dashboard. The thing is, at this point in your training, they really don't teach you much about the hardware, right? I barely knew how to fly the damn thing, and my low voltage light starts glowing. I don't know what that means. I mean, I can kind of guess, right? Like, okay, something with electricity. It's about the extent of my knowledge of these things, right? So my instinct is check the other instruments. Right, so I do. One by one, I look at every other instrument on my dashboard. My altimeter says you're not losing altitude, everything's fine. Right? My airspeed indicator says, well, hey, your speed's fine, you're great. My navigation aid says you're on course, everything's fine. Right? Every other instrument on that control panel says there's no problem, everything's fine. So I kind of let those other instruments outvote the low voltage light. Right? I said it must not really be that big of a problem. Right? No other instrument is reporting anything anomalous, so I'm just going to ignore it and keep flying. Turns out that was a really bad decision. I nearly crashed the airplane that day. I ended up completely lost in a storm with no electronics, no navigation, no radio, no lights, and violating international airspace. Fortunately, I did make it down eventually, almost out of fuel, but I made it down, and I realized, you know what? This is the same thing I'm doing in my organization. And I was a new CEO, and often, my world is overwhelmingly complex, as many of you know, right? Overwhelmingly complex, and often it's one person that senses something that no one else does, right? And often that one person fails to be able to drive change in my organization because of it. And the irony is I had become a CEO partly because I was sick and tired of being the low voltage light in my organizations before that. Right? You ever had that experience where you're sensing something that no one else is, and it's really hard to drive change in the system? And I think that's such a universal human experience in most organizations today. Right? We humans become the sensors. If we want a conscious business, it has to start with conscious individuals sensing something that could be better and able to drive change because of it. But I constantly felt like there was so much around me in the system getting in the way of me being able to drive meaningful change. Right? The politics, the bureaucracy, the meetings, there was so much. The system resisted change. And I realized even as a CEO that was true. Even as a CEO, I would often feel frustrated that I was sensing something and wanting to drive change and struggling to do so. And if the CEO is feeling that way, I'm sure everyone else is even more. So that for me created a compelling question. How do I build an organization where anything sensed by anyone, anywhere in the company, has somewhere to go where it can get rapidly and reliably processed into meaningful change to the extent it's relevant to our shared purpose? And I experimented for years. So I built my software company at the time as a laboratory, and I just experimented. What are new ways to organize, to govern a company? And we tried a lot of things. Turned out most of the experiments we ran were just terrible ideas that didn't work. But along the way, some did. And over years, we started creating a new way of organizing. And I want to talk about that. But first, I want to talk about what we're used to, right? Which is the management hierarchy. This is the way we've been structuring organizations for quite some time now. And it's so common and so prevalent that most people don't realize it's a choice. Right? This is an unconscious way of structuring companies today if you're not consciously choosing it. And that's exactly what I did when I was a new entrepreneur and I started my first business. I didn't sit down with my co-founders and say, how should we structure power in our company? Do we want to centralize it with a CEO and then break it down a hierarchy of managers? Right? We need alignment, we need to scale, right? We need some way to keep things in control. Do we want to do that this way? Or do we want to try to find a different structure for organizing power? We never had that conversation. It was an unconscious default choice. Right? So when it comes to conscious capitalism, if we want to be leading a conscious business, I would posit this, that we should at least make this a conscious consideration. Maybe you choose this. Maybe this is the right power structure for your organization. Great. But I think there's an opportunity to choose this consciously or to choose an alternative. And I do think today, looking at alternatives might make a lot of sense for us, whatever we ultimately decide, because this structure has worked really well over the past couple of centuries. We've seen more economic development in the world driven by companies organized this way, right, than any prior point in human history. This has been a staggeringly successful organizational structure for last century. But the world has changed. We're in a very different world today. The complexity, the uncertainty. I think we're sitting here today talking about alternatives to running a company, alternative structures, not because this has failed us, but because this has succeeded so wildly, it's created a world more complex than it can manage. Right? I think we see lots of limits with these structures today. The politics, the bureaucracy, the difficulty people on the front line have driving change in an organization. So there are alternatives. There are different paradigms, in fact, for how we can achieve order. One of them is the concept of emergent order and self-organization. And we see this in societies and cities and free markets all over the place. I can pretty much trust any modern city in the world today. I can fly in and find a place to eat and a place to sleep and a ride where I need it. And I don't need a supply chain management department figuring all that out for me. Right? I don't need a big top-down predictive plan. Right? Rather, I can trust that there are individuals in this society that are free to locally adapt. There are entrepreneurs that run businesses. There are taxi drivers. There are markets and shops. I have this whole framework of order around me. Right? And yet it's not a top-down controlled order. There's a framework, there's laws, there's regulations, there's a societal framework that keeps us operating together in healthy ways. But within that framework, in society, we have a lot of freedom to follow our local purpose and adapt. Right? So we don't need the same kind of top-down planned economies. In fact, we've seen in human history, when we try to organize an economy through a top-down planned approach, it underperforms significantly a more self-organizing, emergent market society. Different way of achieving order. And we know as a human society, we know this works better. Except then we go into our companies and it's like we've stepped back into the feudal ages. Right? There's kings and barons and peasants. And we try to organize this whole thing through this top-down control scheme. But there are other ways. So how do you bring that in to an organization, of course, is the question. And before I give you a glimpse of that, let me give another metaphor that I love, the human body. Right? Trillions of cells in our body, all working together. There is no CEO cell telling the others what to do. Right? There is no management hierarchy of cells that have more status than other cells and who then have, direct reports that they can kind of organize. And right? It's a very different kind of structure. Right? We do, though, have larger functions. We have organs that integrate the work of all of these autonomous cells. Right? So there is a type of hierarchy, but it's not a command hierarchy of people directing other people, or cells directing other cells. This is nature's approach to scaling. It's a great example. It's building on autonomy. It's taking autonomous cells that have their own internal self-organizing process, and it's stitching them together into a larger whole. Right? The organ doesn't violate the autonomy of the cells or tell them what to do. It takes their autonomy and it builds on it into a larger autonomous functioning unit, which itself is just a part of yet a larger organ system. Right? Autonomy at every level, self-organization at every level, and an emergent order that lets you sit here and think about holacracy and not about how to pump your heart or move oxygen in and out of your cells or whatever, right? You can ignore that complexity. That's what I want as CEO. I want to be able to ignore the complexity going on in my organization so that I can focus on big thoughts. Right? The more you get this kind of self-organizing structure, the more team and say, guess what, guys? You're all empowered. Right? Good luck. Right? Go. Self-organize. Lead. You don't get an empowered team. You get a lot of confused people. Right? Because people know there are some limits. There are some boundaries. There's something they can't do. And if they don't know what that is, they don't know what they can do. Right? If you don't know your limits, you don't know your freedom. Right? And if you don't clarify that, people are going to spend a lot of time trying to search for where are the boundaries, or just in case, let's just check it out with the boss. Or let's call a meeting and make sure everyone's bought into what I think I should do. Because they don't know what they're free to just go autocratically lead and decide. So ironically, if you want a deeply empowering environment where people don't call big painful meetings to try to build buy-in all the time or run things up a management hierarchy, what you need is clarity on the structures, the boundaries, the limits, and the rules. And they need to be the minimally sufficient, lightweight versions of those. Because when you have that clarity and people know, here are my boundaries, they know their freedom. They know if you don't know what you can't do without talking to someone else, you don't know what you can do without having to talk to anyone. Right? Which is really what Holacracy as a framework is about. It's just about clarifying boundaries. It's about the very same things we want good managers to do. Right? We want a good manager in a management hierarchy, not to micromanage and boss around, but to create clarity. Clarity of here's your responsibilities, here's your area, here's your boundaries. Within that, no one's going to tell you what to do, you lead. Right? You don't need consensus and buy-in for these things, you just make your decisions and you lead your roles. Holacracy gives you a framework for getting that. I think it's kind of sad when we try to put all that on a manager. That's a huge burden. It's really hard to create that kind of clarity. No wonder managers fall back to micromanaging all the time. It's much easier. Right? You need help. So let me get more concrete with you and show you how Holacracy works. There's two big myths I want to hit about self-management in general and Holacracy specifically. One is that when you throw out managers and you do this approach at the end of the day, you have no managers. There's nothing that looks like a management hierarchy. Right? One big myth is when you do that, you throw out structure. And that's not true. Companies that are self-managing today have more structure, not less than a management hierarchy. You just get to the structure differently. You don't get there through a top-down definition from managers who frankly don't do that very well usually. You get there from a more emergent process across a whole team of clarifying what do we need to expect from each other? Who needs to do what to get our purpose met? You get more clear structure when you don't have managers, as long as you have the right framework. Or said another way, it's like you invite everybody to be part of the function of management. Another way you could say this, it's management without managers. Because you do still need the function of clarifying, of structuring. Right? You just don't necessarily need to vest that function in one person and expect them to be a superhero about it. You can get the whole team involved in the function of management. So here's what I mean by more structure. This is one of the roles I fill in my company. Holacracy is a role-based system, so the work gets broken down and clarified into roles. This is one of about 30 roles I fill in my organization. Right? So roles are functions. They're micro units. They're not a job description. It's not one giant thing. I fill 30 roles in like 6 different teams. And that's common. It's a lot, but most people will fill 10 roles, 20 roles. Right? A lot of different teams. It's not uncommon. And the role has a purpose. Every role here has a purpose, right? Holacracy is a purpose-driven system. The organization has a purpose, and it's all about breaking it down. So every role should have a clear purpose, and that's my purpose in my role I'm filling right now, my spokesperson role. Right? And then the role has some accountabilities. This tells others what they can expect of me. right? What I'm accountable for, what they can count on me for. So the golden rule of Holacracy, what makes this system so interesting to me, I love this part. When you fill a role, to serve your role's purpose, or one of your accountabilities, you have the full authority to make any decision or take any action to get the job done, as long as there's not an explicit rule against it. This is the opposite of the way most companies implicitly work. In most companies today, the implicit norm is don't make a decision or take an action outside of what you normally do without getting permission first. And you get permission in one of two ways in most companies. You either run it up the management hierarchy and make sure the boss is okay with it, or more commonly, you call a meeting and you socialize the decision and you make sure your whole team is bought into it, and that gives you the permission to go forward. And if you don't believe me that that's the implicit norm, try an experiment. Try going and tomorrow make a big, bold, autocratic decision outside what you normally do without talking to anyone in advance and tell them afterwards, and see how many people you piss off. Right? There is an implicit operating norm in most companies today: don't act without approval. So the first major shift here, it turns that on its head. It says you don't need permission, you already have it. Go be an entrepreneur, be the CEO of your role. Right? You don't need to ask for permission or get buy-in. It's your role, lead it. When you have a purpose or you have an accountability to get done, you have the full authority to make any decision or take any action to make it happen, unless there's a rule against it. So instead of trying to push people to go faster, we're going to say by default, go fast, and we'll put in some speed bumps in your way when we need to. We'll slow you down when we need to. So let's look at how we slow people down, because that's kind of critical here, right? You do need some rules, you need some restrictions, you need some speed bumps on the journey. So here's another role I work with, our web architect role. And this role has its own purpose, right? A clear and stylish website for our company. But this role has what we call a domain. Think of that as the role's property. This role controls as its property our website. What that's telling me in my spokesperson role is that I have the authority to make any decision I want or take any action I want, but if I want to mess with the website, that's my neighbor's property and I should go ask his permission. Right? It's kind of like in society, right? I know I can live my life. I get to lead my life. I don't need to go get buy-in. If I were to run my personal household like the way we run most companies, and I wanted to redecorate my kitchen, I'd call a big meeting in the neighborhood. Right? I'd say, hey guys, I want to redecorate my kitchen. What do you all think we should do with my kitchen? Right? What color should we paint the walls? What do you think? And I try to socialize it and get buy-in. Fortunately, I don't do that in life. I just say, it's my kitchen. All right? If I have a neighbor that's good at interior design, I might ask for some input, but I know the burden of leadership is on me. I'm going to make the decision. I'm going to lead my house. And my neighbor is going to lead his. We know where the property line is. We know the boundary. This is bringing that into organizations. It clarifies where are the property breakdowns so you know who leads what. Now, to be clear, it doesn't matter if I'm the founder of the company and I used to have the CEO title. The title doesn't mean anything after you adopt this kind of system. It doesn't matter if I'm the founder and ex-CEO. I still need to go ask permission from our web architect if I want to mess with the website. It's his property. This is a decentralized control system. Although, in this case, it is centralizing control of the website within a decentralized system. It's really interesting. Just like society, right, or the human body. Your heart has centralized control of some things for your body, but within a system where every organ controls something for the overall whole. Right? Very similar here. So, doesn't matter, there's no status differentials here that matter. All that matters is our web architect controls the website, and if I want to mess with it, I need to make sure I'm not going to cause harm by checking in with him first. So if I'm not messing with the website or any other role's property, then I can go lead my role as I wish, just like in real life. So that said, that's not enough. If you want to see this fail, you can get really excited about this idea and go try to define all the roles in your organization and all of the different accountabilities on them and all of the domains or the properties, right? If you go out and try to define that all up front, you're going to end up with a bureaucratic mess, not a nimble, conscious organization. What you really need is a process to clarify these over time. You don't want to try to figure it out in advance. You will get it wrong, and then it will get stuck. Right? So the goal of Holacracy is to let these structures evolve based on the real work of a team. Right? So let me give an example of how that works. So in Holacracy, we have a governance meeting. And every team is doing this. So every team, we call it a circle. Every circle, this is our outreach circle, like marketing, basically. So every month or so, our outreach circle has a governance meeting, and anyone filling a role in that circle is invited to show up and participate in the governance. So the governance process is happening in every team, not just once at the top. Right? Every team's doing this. And my spokesperson role is in there, our web architect role is in there, right? Some other roles. And in that meeting, we can propose a change to any other role on the team, or to any of the property lines, or any of the policies of that team. Right? As long as it's to serve our role's purpose. It has to be grounded, and here's a real example I have of where I could better express my purpose if I made this change. Right? So anyone can propose a change. And here's an example of how that worked. True story. When we first created this role, my spokesperson role, it didn't have all these accountabilities. It just had a purpose. Right? I think we may have started with one accountability or something like that. It was lightweight. Most roles start that way. They're nearly empty. Because if there's no tension and things are just working, you don't need to document all these accountabilities. Just go, lead your purpose, do stuff, everything's fine. But then tension will show up. So in this case, let's look at, as an example, this third accountability, defining criteria for acceptable speaking engagements. Here's where that came from. We get a lot of invitations to do talks like this. And we can't possibly accept them all. There's way too many. So we have another role. It's called casting agent. The casting agent role on my team, she gets all the invites, and she sorts through them and figures out which ones to send me to and which ones not. Right? And early on in our company's history, she was doing a lot of work negotiating with a conference and talking about it, and then at the end of her process, she'd present it to me. And I'd shoot it down and say, no, I'm not going to go to that one. Right? Wrong market, or it's not big enough, or whatever. And she felt really disempowered. You know, imagine that. She's doing all this upfront work, negotiating, talking, building a relationship, and at the end of her process, I say, no, I'm not going. So she feels frustrated. So instead of just complaining or whatever might happen in a typical company, socializing, politicking about it, whatever, instead, she shows up in a governance meeting. And in that meeting, she makes a proposal to add this accountability. She says, if I could count on you to be defining criteria for acceptable speaking engagements, I could look at your criteria, and I could assess myself up front, not at the end of my process, and not waste my time with the ones that didn't seem like a good fit. So I'd like to be able to expect that from you. So she proposed adding that accountability to my role. It took 2 minutes to resolve that proposal and get that accountability added. One of the reasons it's so fast is we're not looking for consensus. We're not discussing it to death and looking for buy-in. We're asking one simple question in that process. Does anyone see a reason why it will cause harm to your ability to get your purpose done if we add that expectation on this role? That's it. And there's some other rules around that. I won't go into it in depth now, but there's lots on our website if you want to explore that process more, the governance process. We don't use it to make every decision. We use it specifically to define the roles and the expectations. So she proposed that. It took 2 minutes, and at the end of 2 minutes, she had that new expectation added to my role, so she could turn to me after the meeting and say, so when do you think you're going to have that done for me by? You know? Now, the interesting footnote to this story, I'm the founder of the company. She was our newest hire right out of college. Right? In what companies do you know where the newest hire right out of college in 2 minutes can add an expectation onto the founder and then turn to him and say, so when are you going to have that done for me by? Right? I think that's really cool because she needed it to get her purpose met. It was to serve her role's purpose. Right? There was no status involved, no egos, no politics. It didn't need any of that because it wasn't about that. It was about the purpose and what she needed in her work to get the job done. And is it going to get in the way of me expressing my purpose to be accountable for defining that criteria? No, that's fine. Right? So really cool to see how that kind of change can get enacted. Now imagine that done in every team, every month, regularly. And what you're doing is changing the entire way you're building your organization structure. It's now an emergent structure that's happening based on what's really happening in the work. And with everybody involved in creating and defining the structure, which is typically the work of a manager. But frankly, I wouldn't have known, I didn't know that that was a needed function of my role. But she did. right? So now I, the old manager, don't have to heroically define the entire structure. I've got the whole team sensing tensions, as we call it, consciously, right? Which is what this is about, designing your organization structure one tension at a time. And I don't mean tension in a negative way. I just mean the feeling you get when you sense a gap between what is and what could be. Right? That, to me, is the heart of consciousness. It is our ability to sense, to perceive, to be conscious of something. And what we're often conscious of is this pull in ourselves, this feeling, often in the body or the emotions. It's a feeling of a gap between what is and what could be. The goal of Holacracy is very simply to make sure anyone who feels a tension about how to better express their purpose has somewhere to go where it can get rapidly and reliably processed into meaningful change in the organization. This is what my org chart looks like then. We don't have managers, so I can't do the typical command hierarchy chart, but this is our org chart. Every one of those green and blue dots is a role, right? And they're grouped in these circles. And these circles themselves are like roles within a bigger circle. Right? So we have governance in our GCC, or our general company circle. And the governance there is about how do these different circles integrate? How does our service delivery team work with our outreach marketing team, right? What are the connections between the whole teams? And this scales much larger. This is a picture of Zappos at about 1,600 employees, right? We've got thousands of roles in this company and hundreds of circles. And interesting, if I looked at their structure now, right? This is a screenshot of a software tool called GlassFrog that's used to structure this for companies doing Holacracy. If I looked at their screenshot now of their chart, it looks completely different than when I took this screenshot like a year ago. Right? I find that really awesome. It's living, it's breathing, it's changing. Every team is learning constantly. Right? And the whole structure is shaping itself as a result. Right? Just like a society. So one other piece I want to introduce, you can think of Holacracy as like a game or a sport for organization, right? And every game needs a good rule book, right? Every sport needs some basic rules. So with Holacracy, this is a constitutional approach to running a company. Instead of the rules existing in the boss's head, and you have to figure out what they are, which is honestly the way most management hierarchies work, right? The boss has a set of rules in their head about what you can do and not do or whatever. You have to figure them out. And they might change based on the boss's mood or the day of the week, right? Instead, there's a written set of rules that define how the governance structure works in this Holacracy constitution. It doesn't tell you how to run your company. It doesn't tell you how to pay people, fire people, hire people, market your services, build things. It doesn't tell you any of that. All it tells you is, here's how you govern. Here's how you define roles. And here's what a role means. When you have a role, you have the authority to take any action to get the job done, unless there's a rule against it. Right? That's what's defined in the Constitution. So it's a generic document. It's the same Constitution used by 1,000 companies all over the world. Those 1,000 companies look completely different. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's a meta framework for how to customize anything else. Which, interestingly, is exactly what a management hierarchy is. It's a meta framework, right? Most companies in the world today are using management hierarchy, but they all look very different. That's because the management hierarchy doesn't tell you exactly how to do anything. It gives you a framework to decide that, to figure out how your processes work and how your teams function. This is a different meta framework, a different approach. And it's one that vests power, not in a CEO and then broken down a hierarchy of managers, but rather in a constitutional process, a governance process, which then goes on to empower roles. So when companies adopt this, once they've gotten a taste of it and they want to move forward, the first move is for the CEO to sign a declaration ceding their power to run the organization into that Holacracy constitution. Sign a document saying, as CEO, I am placing my power, like a king ceding power into a constitutional process, right? It's like that. I'm ceding my power into this rule set, and you can hold me to these rules. And I'm going to hold you to these rules. And these rules don't tell us everything. They just give us the meta framework of how to govern, how to create the roles we need and evolve them over time. So this is pretty cool. This means after doing that, you'll see this really in companies. You'll see the former CEO go to somebody, give them feedback or input, and the person says, yeah, thanks, I'll consider your input, but I think I'm going to go a different direction. You know? I love that, personally. As a former CEO, I got so sick and tired of people coming to me and saying, what do you want me to do about something? Most of the time, my answer was, I want you to figure out what to do about that. That's why I hired you, right? Now, when they come to me and say, what do you want me to do about something that's not in my roles, that's in their roles, I can push it right back and say, I don't actually have the authority to decide that for you. Right? That authority, I placed all the authority in my CEO office into this Constitution. That Constitution put it in your role. Our governance process put that in your role. The burden of leadership is yours, not mine. If you want my input, I'm happy to help, right? I'm happy to collaborate. I'm happy to give you my thoughts. But let's be clear, at the end of the day, this is your burden of leadership, not mine. You lead this role, not me. If I need to expect something from your role, I know what to do. I go to the governance process and I can do it. Sometimes I get asked by reporters, how did you get comfortable giving away control of your organization like this? And I say, you've got it wrong. I have more control, not less. The difference is, so does everyone else, right? This is about raising control, raising the power of everyone in the system, not stripping it away from the people formerly at the top. Right? I can go to governance just like anyone else, and I can propose whatever new expectations I need on the team, whatever boundaries or limits or policies I need. I can still do that. Now, I have to do that through a governance process, and if one of them gives a really good reason why it's going to get in the way of their work, I need to deal with that. There's a process for that in governance. But so can they. They can use the process too, just like I can. It's a very different system this creates. So, to summarize some of the key shifts, we're going from these static job descriptions that, let's be honest, no one ever looks at, no one cares about, and aren't very useful, to these dynamic roles that are changing constantly. It's the output of the team's learning process. They're real and they're meaningful. And they're small chunks. You might fill 20 roles in 5 different teams, not just one place in a hierarchy. And instead of authority being delegated to you by a boss, which really means, get in the boss's head and figure out what they really mean, right? Instead, you have constitutional authority, an empowering system. You don't need a boss to empower you. There are no bosses. So good luck if you're looking for one to empower you. The system is empowering. And instead of the big reorg every few years, you're doing a micro reorg, tension-driven iteration every month in a governance process. You're constantly redesigning your company. And that means you don't need the politics, right? You have a different way to get alignment. You can get there through a transparent governance process that everyone has equal access to constantly update the design of your company. And that is an approach to running a company without managers. It's a completely, I hope I've given you a glimpse, as I started with, a radical new way of organizing power, a new social technology. So, thank you all. Have a great day.